We want to start with the president's speech, and joining us now, we've got a fantastic panel. Former California Democratic Congresswoman Jane Harman, who is now president and CEO of the Woodrow Wilson Center. Ravi Agrawal, who is the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy. Yamiche Alcindor, PBS NewsHour White House correspondent and an MSNBC political analyst. So let me start with sort of the big picture, if I can, Yamiche, what the message is from the new president. A clear acknowledgement of the hill that has to be climbed, saying things like reclaiming our credibility and moral authority, much of which has been lost, sending a direct message to State Department staffers, and just overall talking about the importance of diplomacy. What's your big picture takeaway, Yamiche, and what does the president want the takeaway to be?
The big picture takeaway, and the one that I think Biden really is trying to hammer home here, is that America is back, that the diplomacy is back, and this idea that we are going to treat our allies like allies. We're going to go after multilateral agreements. We're going to make sure that we're being responsible with the role that the United States plays in the world, including on climate, but also on welcoming refugees, where we heard him say that he's going to be increasing that refugee cap. President Trump had it at historic lows. They hadn't been that low since the 1980s. And what you heard him say also was that we're going to be tough on Russia again, and that we have China in our eyes as both a competitor and as a country that we can deal with. This was President Biden really trying to say the ideas that he put forth during his campaign. He plans to follow through on them. And I think the other thing that's really important here is that he says, yes, America is going to be strong in the global stage, but we're also going to be someone that's going to be a friend, and also going to be someone who's cooperating with other countries. That is a marked difference from President Trump, who really had this, of course, America First agenda that really talked about only keeping America really in the mind when he was making decisions, really putting America's interests above all other interests. What you hear from Biden is saying, yes, of course, I'm going to be interested in America's interests, but I'm also wanting to be a friend and an ally and to be a good neighbor to all the other countries around the world.
A marked difference from the last 4 years, of course, Jane. One of the other things he said was he's interested in rebuilding the atrophied muscle of diplomacy, which has suffered from neglect and abuse. Put it into context for us, that acknowledgement that there's a hill to climb. How high is it? How difficult is it going to be for this administration, Jane?
I'd call it a mountain to climb. Maybe it's, a moonshot to climb. I don't think he climbed to the moon. But let's start with the optic here. He went to the State Department to give the speech. Hugely important. Second of all, he's the most experienced foreign policy president we have had since George H.W. Bush. Decades in Congress as head of the Foreign Relations Committee. In his bones, he knows this stuff. He knows the people. He knows the people in Congress. So I think all of that makes him very strong. And I'm looking at him being introduced by Tony Blinken. He's got the strongest State Department team that I can remember. I mean, since way, way back. But in addition to that, I agree that he hit the right themes. The one thing I didn't hear enough of is that foreign policy by executive order isn't going to make it, because everyone's worried that our next president won't be of the same mind. I think what we need him to be saying, in addition to what he said, was our doctrine now is America will be the indispensable partner to other countries in the world with like interests. And Joe Biden, will build back the State Department and the relationship between my administration and the Congress, so that the policies you see will have support not just from the people I have picked, but the people you have elected.
So, Ravi, let's talk about some of the policy that we already know that this administration plans to follow. The U.S. is going to end its support for the offensive operations in Yemen, one of the world's great humanitarian crises. Talk a little bit about that, the importance of it, and again, how that gets accomplished.
So I think one thing that's very clear is that all of the messages that Biden has given two audiences today, really, as we've just heard. One is the State Department itself, which has been very demoralized, and they got to hear that I will have your back. And then the rest of the world. America is back. Diplomacy is back. And I think the big news out of all of this today is ending the war in Yemen, ending all U.S. support for the war in Yemen. And I think that's going to have a set of ripple effects across the board not only in Yemen itself, but also for relations with Saudi Arabia, which, of course, has backed the war in Yemen along with the United Arab Emirates, and, of course, Iran, which is on the other side of that equation. And that is something that may end up helping Biden in negotiations to try and re-enter the Iran nuclear deal. So quite a few things that Biden is trying to do at once. I think one thing, though, with all of this is that there are no surprises in this speech, right? And that is a good thing because we've just gone through an era of too many surprises. But I think for many of us who've been listening and watching to Biden's remarks over the last year, but also those of his foreign policy team, the question still is how? How are you going to do all of these things? How are you going to have America re-engage with the world in a way that world leaders find credible and lasting? And I think that's something where the jury is still out for a while.
Yeah, there's a couple of pieces of this, and I want to bring in NBC News Chief Foreign Affairs correspondent and Chief Washington correspondent Andrea Mitchell. Andrea, you know better than anybody there are a couple of pieces of this. One of it is policy, reestablishing diplomacy, but the other part of it is the people on the ground, and he was very clear, both speaking earlier today directly to folks at the State Department and then reiterating it at the top of this speech, how important he feels each and every person is. But talk about those two things separate and apart. One is that decision to go to diplomacy, but you also have to have the people in place. What is the ground zero, essentially, that he is starting from in terms of staffing the State Department, staffing the U.S. representation around the world?
It's a complete rebuild. I mean, they are demoralized. People were purged. They were politicized. Career people were either, fired or so demoralized and not involved that they quit and retired early. So a whole category of foreign service people, a whole generation really has been lost practically in just in the last 4 years. The most senior people retiring early. Some he is bringing back. That said, a speech like this, going to the workforce first, saying, I have your backs, there's not going to be politics, basically saying, we are not going to interfere. We're going to let you do your jobs. And people there know that, as the former chairman of Foreign Relations, that he knows this stuff. As the vice president, he knows it. Immediately saying they're not going to withdraw troops from Germany, getting re-engaged in the Afghanistan talks to the extent that they are putting women and girls and the cessation of violence, making the Taliban live up to the demands, re-engaging Kabul so they're not cutting the Afghan government out, all of that. But I agree that the most important thing he said was on Yemen and Saudi Arabia, because that affects the entire region. That affects Iran. The fact that he is saying to Saudi Arabia that we are stopping the support, the engagement in what Tony Blinken has said is the worst humanitarian crisis on the globe is tremendously important. And Blinken said they're doing this precisely to get that humanitarian aid back in. Just think of where President Trump gave his first trip and his first big foreign policy speech in Riyadh, improbably, with a lot of questions about the conflicts of interest involved in that. The signal could not be more important. He drove just a few blocks to the State Department, brought his vice president with him, spoke to the workforce first, talked about diversity, morality, and human rights. Now, the how, as was just said, is the real challenge. He said we're not going to roll over to Vladimir Putin. We're not going to roll over anymore in the face of, Russia attacking our democracy and with cyber attacks and poisoning our allies. But at the same time, how does he accomplish this? How does he accomplish what he wants to accomplish with China, where we are now headed towards a potential confrontation, political or even military, over what's happening in Myanmar, also known as Burma?
Well, one of the things that he made clear, Ruvi, is that he has already reached out, had conversations with a lot of leaders around the world from the expected places, Canada, UK, France, Germany, NATO, reestablishing with NATO. But how difficult will it be to reestablish some of those relationships? And what did you hear in his speech today that was for a foreign audience, that was for a world audience?
Well, I think, again, the symbolism of today is really, really important, as Andrew just pointed out. Again, him choosing to make this speech from the State Department, I think that's going to matter. If you're a world leader in New Delhi or Beijing or Moscow, you're going to understand from that symbolism that this means that diplomacy matters. This means that the State Department matters. This means that the infrastructure that has been so broken over the last 4 years is going to be rebuilt, and therefore systems will be rebuilt. Diplomacy will be rebuilt. I think that is going to be one very big takeaway. The details will come, I imagine, over the next weeks and months, and that's something we can all look out for. I think one problem, however, again, if you are a leader in India, if you are a leader in Turkey, is the sense that Biden doesn't control everything. You know, he can pass some rules and laws through executive order, of course, but beyond that, what is lasting? And this remains the country, as a German official recently told our magazine, no matter what comes next, America will now always be the country that elected Trump. And I think that is something that foreign leaders, allies are always going to remember, and Biden will have to struggle to reassure them that it's not just the 4 years, but we have a longer term plan that's going to outlast just my term.
As you say, many details to look out for. Andrea, were you trying to jump in there? Because I'm very curious what you think in terms of those details will be some of the things that you'll be watching for and foreign leaders will be watching for.
Well, one of the signals today was he referred to January 6th, because people were shaken around the world by seeing America being attacked from within. And what he said was that we are committed to defending democracy around the world, and we've proved that by defending it here at home. A clear reference to what happened on January 6th. So I think as my colleagues there, as Jane and the others have been saying, it is symbolic, but symbols matter in foreign policy. And when he says diplomacy is back, America is back, and he made no bones about criticizing his predecessor. There has always been sort of a traditional honeymoon. President Obama not directly criticizing President Trump. Not so. Today, there was no question that he was criticizing everything that President Trump did in terms of denying diplomacy, speaking of it as the deep state, firing people, not having Yovanovitch's back and other whistleblowers and others testifying in the impeachment hearing who were then shunted aside. The experience of veteran diplomats is now being valued.
Well, to that point, we're already seeing him appointing a long-time career diplomat to a special envoy position to Yemen. But, Jane, let me give you the final word here and what you'll be looking for.
Well, if I could add something along the lines that everyone else has said, restoring our moral authority in the world is going to be a hard slog. I don't know how high the mountain is, but the slog is very long. And that's what will give him the credibility, both with our indispensable partners, but also with Congress, it seems to me, to build back better a foreign policy that was the American foreign policy since 1945. I mean, we always led by example, and we always had allies, and we built regional alliances, and we built international organizations, and they're in tatters. And so starting at the State Department, rebuilding that, and reaching out with a comprehensive Biden doctrine, that's what I would call it, that we will be the indispensable partner. Together with the world, we will solve this COVID monster. That's where we start. And then we will do these other things on his list. That was a good list, is, to me, how we're going to finally, gasp, re-enter a foreign policy process and a foreign policy environment that's really good for America and good for the world.
Jane, Andrea, Ravi, I'm so grateful to have your voices after this important first speech at the State Department. Thanks to all of you. Yamiche, you're going to stay with us.